Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about wealth inequality during the time of the pandemic. My guest for this conversation is John Nichols. John Nichols is a national affairs correspondent with The Nation magazine, and he is the author of a number of books. His latest is called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. John Nichols, a very good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. It's great to be with you, my friend.
Always good to have you. When it comes to wealth inequality, is what we've seen in the past couple of years similar or comparable to the aftermath of what we saw to the 2008 housing crisis?
Yes, in many ways it is. I think, Mitch, this is often the case, be the first person who's asked it in that way. So I have to think about it a little bit, but as I do, I would say yes. Because
obviously differences, right? I mean, we're talking about housing,
yeah.
Pandemic, obviously big differences, but I'm just sort of thinking about crises and the growth of inequality, which seems to be a trend.
Well, let's focus it even more on a phrase that Naomi Klein gave us, which is disaster capitalism, right? Or the shock doctrine. This idea that when something bad happens, those who are in positions of great advantage, be it economic, particularly, or power in general, increasingly take advantage of that circumstance, right? They cash in, if you will. This is a break from the historic pattern in America. We've certainly had profiteering and self-service in the past. That's not something new. We can see it throughout our history. But there were interventions in many critical stages historically. If you look at World War II, for instance, where profiteers were, really cracked down upon and taxed heavily. And since then, we've had many cases where there's been at least some effort. But in recent decades, as we've seen kind of the growth of the neoliberal model and the freeing up of capital to do as it chooses, the argument that we will let the market solve our problem, we have seen this circumstance develop. And certainly after the housing crisis, the economic downturn of 2007, 2008, you saw, literally the wealthiest people in America getting bailouts, literally the government helping them, the banks and well-to-do people, and B, finding ways to advantage themselves massively to become much richer. That increases the gap between rich and poor for a couple of reasons. Number one, those who are on the lower rungs of the economic ladder have, the pain of the actual incident, right? The housing decline, the pandemic, whatever, the natural disaster. But then on top of that, they have the reality that the resources that should go to address that pain are misdirected to the very, very wealthy. And there is simply no question that happened, in 2008, 2009, 2010. It is happening again now. And the play out of the pandemic has been, if anything, more striking, more extreme, even than what we've seen in the past. To give you just the simplest example, and we could talk a lot more and go much deeper on a host of issues here. But the simplest example is this. At the start of the pandemic, the billionaire class in America, the roughly 650 or so people who are billionaires. And remember, that's we're not talking about a 1% there. We're talking about 1/10 of 1%, right? A tiny, tiny portion of Americans. They controlled about $3 trillion. Now, that's massive, right? That's an amazing amount of money. And that had obviously been accumulated through generations of, patterns economically, socially, et cetera. Well, in 2 years, they came to control $5 trillion in wealth. An exponential increase, unprecedented in American history, a redistribution of the wealth upwards that made the billionaire class dramatically wealthier than it had ever been in history.
Almost double.
And yeah, almost. And you had that happen in the midst of a pandemic where we were supposed to be experiencing shared sacrifice. Everybody was supposed to give of themselves, and people did give of themselves. Nurses who showed up in hospitals without protective gear to treat patients, many of those nurses getting sick and in a number of cases dying. grocery store workers who said, well, somebody's got to be there to make sure that people can get food. Folks who worked in delivery, folks who worked in meat packing plants, immigrant workers primarily in some of these plants, who came in knowing that it wasn't safe, but actually feeling that they were serving society. Yeah, they had a job, they had to support themselves, but feeling they were doing something needed. They were sharing in the sacrifice, often getting sick, often dying. And at the same time, our billionaire class, they headed off to their waterfront homes or their country villas, flipped on their computers and started moving money around and became dramatically richer. That increased our wealth inequality, but it also, I think, showed us something about America that we should be horrified by. And that's a big part of why I wrote the book.
I just want to underscore that number you put there. The billionaire class controlled, going into the pandemic, $3 trillion. 2 years later, $5 trillion. I said almost double, not quite, but close. That never happened in 2009, 2010. That never happened in the shock of 1929. Never happened in U.S. history before at that rate.
Not to that extent. Remember, the shock of 1929, the Depression, was kind of a slow-moving crisis. And it actually did harm a number of wealthy folks. There were rich people who lost their fortunes, or at least who saw them dramatically decrease. The interesting thing in the shock of 1929 was that there were corrupt folks, bankers, Wall Street folks, who lied about things and ended up coming out economically better off than other folks. But even they often lost a lot. You know what I mean? They just came out better. And the interesting thing is that in that period, 1929 to 1932, the initial period of the Depression, which lasted a lot longer, there was great anger at anyone who had operated in a self-serving manner. And Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932, the election of an overwhelmingly Democratic House and U.S. Senate, led to aggressive investigations of those people on Wall Street. We've seen nothing like it since in our history. This makes Watergate, Iran-Contra, everything look like child's play. They hired a top prosecutor of the mafia to come down and go after bankers. And there were indictments, ultimately. There were criminal charges. There were incredible fines, astronomical fines as compared to today. And what was most important wasn't the punishment side. What was most important back then was that action, that accountability led to policy. And this is the thing, Mitch. Accountability always leads to policy. It always does. And that's the biggest play out. It's not putting some banker or billionaire in jail. It's not even necessarily simply taxing a billionaire today. What it really is that recognition that there are people who are taking advantage of a circumstance in ways that harm the great mass of Americans, that harm society in general. That leads to policy action. In the Great Depression, it was crackdowns on banking and all sorts of initiatives like Glass-Steagall, which actually worked for a long time. In this current era, there should be different policy initiatives. But the bottom line is that you want accountability, not simply for a backward-looking anger, although that's plenty appropriate in these times, but also for a forward-looking shift in how society operates. And if you don't have accountability, Mitch, you end up in a situation where, as the Canadian folk singer Bruce Cockburn says, the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. And so as a result, without accountability, we'll end up in a situation where what we saw during the pandemic will be not just repeated, but made exponentially worse in the future.
That investigation that occurred after 1929, what was it called? The
Pecora Commission.
That's right.
Yeah, and this is Ferdinand Pecora. He was a remarkable guy, an immigrant who got a law degree, at night, working class lawyer who made his name prosecuting corrupt financial activities in New York City. And he got a real reputation for figuring out how people dealing in stocks ripped off working class people, right? Convinced people to invest whatever tiny amount of money they had in stocks that weren't going to succeed. This is called a bucket shop. And he prosecuted people, he put them in jail, he tracked down the mobsters and the others that were behind these things. He got a reputation as an incredibly ferocious prosecutor. He was known as the hellhound of Wall Street. And when Congress started looking into it, somebody said, well, let's hire the hellhound of Wall Street to be our lawyer here. Let's put him there. And what he did was just, I guess it's unimaginable. It would be, to give you an equivalent, and it's a very appropriate way of having a perspective on it. He brought the equivalence of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk before a congressional committee, used the power of the congressional committee to force them to testify under oath, and then ripped into them with incredible research and everything he had, to the point where they were shamed and in some cases forced to pay fines, to change their behaviors, and ultimately to face regulatory shifts that made it impossible for such figures to do what they had done again. So imagine that. Imagine if today we had Musk and Bezos and the other wealthiest people in this country called before congressional committees and held to account. That's the equivalent of what happened in 1933 and 1934.
So coming to today, how did this billionaire class go from controlling $3 billion pre-pandemic to controlling $5 trillion now, 2 years later?
The simple answer is they already had a lot of money. And the best way to make money is to have money, right? So that you can invest it in a difficult situation. Well, so we suddenly found ourselves in a difficult situation where we were going to have supply chain challenges, where certain industries that had not really existed or had not been very big were going to get exponentially bigger. And if you had money to put into basically betting on the pain and suffering of society, you could make a fortune, right? You and I are speaking right now via Zoom. And I don't know, did you know what Zoom was before the pandemic?
Nope.
Right? But if you got a lot of money and you see, oh, wow, everybody's going to have to be doing video, you invest in that, right? And so there's a lot of folks who say, well, it's great. Somebody was smart. They invested well. And I understand that. And this is not, to necessarily punish that, but it is to say that we need to have a standard for how you profit off a miserable or difficult situation. Now, it's not just Zoom is a secondary thing, a minor thing. What we're really talking about is medical supplies and food and all sorts of other things. And here's the deal. During World War II, when it's a very different circumstance, but it was a circumstance where we were all hands on deck, shared sacrifice. The Roosevelt administration had a very simple model. They said that profits you made above what you were making before the pandemic, either as an individual or a company, you're going to be taxed at about 90% on that. So basically, you can't, if you're engaged in cashing in on a national crisis or a national challenge, you're just not going to be able to take that money. Well, we don't have any standard like that today. And so what you saw was the billionaire class cashed in, right? They found the ways to make exponential profits, not to make a little bit more or something like that, or to put money in an interesting place, to make exponential profits that were by any measure obscene. That's one side of it, Mitch. The other side, and this is an important part of it, is that those who controlled necessary services, right, what are essentially utilities in our society today, were able to make massive increases in their wealth. And so if you look at the people who during the pandemic, kind of made the most money, right? It's folks like, owners of Google, right? And Apple and, all these things that we need because suddenly we were living online a lot more than physically. And of course, that brings us to Jeff Bezos, right? Because Amazon became, ubiquitous, incredibly necessary. Again, a utility. I mean, on my street, I see an Amazon truck every 5 minutes. Right?
It's interesting you called it a utility.
Yeah, it's a utility, right? It's like people don't say, "Oh, I'm going to the store." They say, "I'm going to go on Amazon and get this." Right? It's effectively something that it's not something that actually produces goods. It's a platform, right, on which a lot of goods are piled up, and then you give them money, they get you the goods. But they're If they charge more for it, right? Or if they become dramatically more necessary in this period, and instead of sacrificing, because these are hard times, these are times that a lot of people are unemployed, underemployed, facing a lot of challenges, they say, are you kidding? We're going to make more money, right? And many of the companies that use Amazon, that operate off it, and remember, Amazon is no longer a book operation, although it does sell books, without a doubt. And it probably maybe not the wisest thing to criticize if you're an author, but it's just the reality that they're everything you can imagine is being sold.
They own Whole Foods, and so they're delivering, not
food,
just delivering, they're producing food now.
And they're also, but it's just, you just can't even begin to imagine what people can get delivered to their door. Understand that. And so they obviously cashed in, and they've continued to cash in. Bezos had an exponential increase, tens of billions of dollars increase in his wealth, second wealthiest man in the world after Musk, leading to a situation during the pandemic that Jeff Bezos was, there were articles saying that there's a good chance that by 2026, Jeff Bezos will be the first trillionaire, not billionaire, trillionaire, because of the exponential increase in his wealth. And the only debate being whether it's him or Musk. And you say, okay, well, lucky break, right? You own the right company at the right time. But again, you have that incredible level of profiteering, right? That price gouging, taking advantage of the circumstance, and one additional reality. And if we use Bezos as an example, he is not the only one of this. In the case of Jeff Bezos, he owns a network of warehouses. Amazon owns a network of warehouses, Bezos being the kind of primary figure within that company, not the only one. But they own this network of warehouses. The people working in those warehouses at the start of the pandemic started to get sick. People died. And there were folks in the warehouses as early as March of 2020 who said, hey, hold it, this is terrible. We're working 24/7. We know we're essential. We are, again, a utility. And we have to do this. This has to happen. But we're not being protected. We don't have the protective gear we need. We don't have the hours we need. Some of our plants are getting, really dangerous. We need to, shut warehouses for at least a brief period of time so we can make them safe. They just ask for basic safety protections. The most prominent person who did that, Christian Smalls, was fired. He was literally fired as he basically said, this place needs to be safe. And then you saw a growth of union organizing at these warehouses around the country. It's still happening as we speak. And Bezos and the people around him, as I write about in the book, set out to smear the union organizers, to lie about what those organizers were doing, to undermine them in every way, spending a fortune in anti-union activities at a time when we knew that unionizing those places would make people safer and ultimately make the whole system more functional. And so you end up in this situation where, with the billionaire class, you can identify many ways in which they cashed in, price gouged, profiteered, and used their power and their position to exponentially increase their wealth at a time when, again, it's important to have that perspective. We were telling nurses, look, you got to go to that hospital. We know you don't have the gear you need. Do the best you can. And nurses actually did that. And, immigrant workers in meatpacking plants, we know you don't have the gear you need, but go in and do the best you can because people need to be fed. And they did that. And we have example after example after example. I write in the book chapter after chapter about different sectors of the economy. Bus drivers who literally in February of 2020 knew that their buses were unsafe, right? But they said, but I got to get people to the hospital. I got to get people to work. And so they went to work. And one of the first people to raise the alarm about the lack of safety of buses up in the Seattle area literally died after getting COVID working on his bus. This happened again and again and again. And so we have this divide in our society. It isn't just economic inequality, Mitch. It's social inequality. It's people who feel they have a responsibility to their fellow men and women and who live up to that responsibility. They share in their sacrifice, as painful as it is. And then people who look at a difficult situation and say, how can I get richer?
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with John Nichols. John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent with The Nation magazine. He joins us for a conversation on his book, Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. John Nichols, I want to stay with Amazon here because it kind of is the behemoth of our day now. During the pandemic, and I think within the last year, it increased its Prime membership rate. And also, its food delivery with Whole Foods, which became incredibly important for people during the time of the pandemic, who were scared to go grocery shopping. They were
literally told not to go grocery shopping.
They were told not to go grocery shopping.
Yeah, they told get it delivered. Yeah.
Amazon at first was providing that delivery for free. I mean, you would tip, you would leave a tip for the deliverer, which was fine. But they now even charge $10 per delivery. This is on top of them already, I think what you're saying, is receiving record profits.
And Mitch, I write about this a lot. Amazon, and we should keep focused on Amazon because it's a good place to focus, but we should understand it's the model for corporations in America today. And we should always understand, if you look at history of business, at history of how corporations operate, the big ones tend to set the stage for what everybody else does. So Henry Ford, for all of his many flaws, paid his workers a living wage so that they could buy his cars. That became something of a model in industry, pressed on, obviously, ultimately by the United Auto Workers Union and others. And so the big guys do tend to set the stage. Amazon, with its response to this crisis, which is how can we make the most money? And also, how can we increase charges on things that people absolutely need? Again, that similar to what a utility would do. If it's essentially the necessary entity, that kind of the one that you turn to. If they exponentially increase their prices, you can't really turn away from them. That has become a model throughout corporate America. And so I can point you to example after example after example. A company announces record profits and price increases. That's absurd, Mitch, right? If you're posting record profits in a difficult time, you should be thankful, right? Wow, we did great. That's really good. You shouldn't say, and why don't we stick it to our customers a little more? Why don't we gouge more out of them because we know that this is a time where we can get away with that? It's this notion of getting away with whatever you can get away with without any accountability. That's impunity. And that's what Amazon has practiced through this period. And here's an interesting thing. You mentioned that $10 charge, right? And I think a lot of Americans, certainly middle-class Americans, will say, well, $10, I'll notice it, but you can do that. But the key is that when you're dealing in the numbers that an Amazon deals in, right? That $10 charge, suddenly you're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions.
A lot of money.
Right? Exactly. And what many of these big companies have done, and we could talk about the pharmaceutical companies in a little bit, is they have figured out how they can keep kind of ladling on the extra charge, right? Keep putting on a few cents here, a few cents there, a little bit of encouragement to buy this Prime service or do that, and make more money than they make by their basic service, right? And imagine if, again, we'll stick with the utility model. Imagine if your utility said to you, you know what? If you want to turn the air conditioning up in the summer, you can, but it's going to be a $10 extra charge, right? Or if you want heat in winter, it's going to be a $10. You know what I mean? It's just if you have companies that are essential, right? They provide an essential service, and they look at a disaster or a challenging situation and say, how are we going to make more money? How can we cash in on this? That is a place where government is supposed to intervene, right? That is a place where the market is not serving humanity. The market is harming humanity. And we just didn't have that intervention. We have not had that intervention during the pandemic. And it is a serious issue.
It is also striking, of course, we're dealing with inflation now. It's also striking how corporate profits is fueling inflation. I heard a statistic, so off the top of my head, so you could double check me, but I heard a statistic that traditionally corporate profits will cause about 11% of overall inflation that's happening. But this time it's like half.
Yeah. Well, and there's a reason to understand it. Corporate profits don't in and of themselves cause inflation, right? It's how you get your profits. and so if you are price gouging and, kind of taking advantage of the situation to maintain your profits, right? To maintain a high level of profit, then you're going to, that's definitely going to spur inflation, right? And especially if you have a product that people need. Now, I can give you an example. I once worked as a young reporter, I worked for a newspaper, and it was a family-owned newspaper, and they were very, very proud of their paper. It was very, very big presence in this community. And when a recession occurred, the family took lower earnings, lower profits, right? Because they were like, well, we're not going to lay off our reporters and not produce a newspaper. We're again, something like a utility, right? We are there. We're present. We intend to remain. And I remember being on the union side in that and negotiating. And it wasn't like these folks were necessarily, trying to be super humane. They were tough negotiators in union contract negotiations, but they accepted a certain social contract, right? They provided a service. People valued that service and needed it. If it became a little difficult to provide that service, maybe they made a little less money, right? But on the theory that the economic patterns would bring them back into a pretty comfortable place, and they were comfortable enough to start with. Well, that's not how companies operate today. It's not even in the ballpark. How they operate today is to say, we just made record profits. And if we increase our prices because of the necessity of our product, we'll make even bigger profits. That not only brings more money in, but that attracts more investors. So remember how we talked about billionaires moving their money around? Well, that's where you end up with this inflationary cycle where, they're price gouging, they're making more profits, more money is flowing to these companies, right? Investors are putting money there, not putting money into companies that are acting responsibly, right? That aren't trying to profiteer. So you end up with this vicious cycle. And again, this is something that could be broken. It's easily broken. It's not complex to figure this out. You and I are figuring it out in our conversation, on a weekday morning in late May. And so they could do it. But to do the right thing, right? We have to break the hold of disaster capitalism on our economic thinking. And I read a lot about that in the book because to make that break, there has to be an accountability moment. There has to be a moment where we pause and say what we're saying today, which is we had a pandemic. It was overwhelming. It's cost 1 million lives, probably substantially more than that. Tens of millions of people infected with the disease, for some of whom, roughly some estimates say as many as 20% of whom have lingering challenges related to that disease. Hundreds of millions of people who have gone through economic dislocation, turbulence, challenges over the last couple of years. This is a societal hit. We were hit hard. And the notion that there would be no accountability for those who profiteered off that it's jaw-dropping. And it also is dangerous because if we don't have accountability, we'll continue this pattern.
Tell me about the pharmaceuticals. Now, I think obviously we can guess that their profits went way up, but of course you had pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson who've come up with vaccines for COVID that even as we see transmission rates once again increasing, we're not seeing the same kind of rises in levels at the hospitals or in the death rate. So in a big way, I think they've been pretty much portrayed as heroes in this pandemic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So look, let's begin with the basics. I am double vaccinated and double boosted. And when they propose a new booster, I'm going to go get it. Now, I know some folks may not like that. There are There are folks who are, critical of vaccines, et cetera. I'm not. I'm glad the vaccine exists. I think it's made me safer. I'm for it. But we have to, in our minds, separate that understanding of the vaccine from the profiteering off it. And so let's put some basic things on the table. Pharmaceutical companies don't like to do vaccines. It's not what they enjoy doing. They like to do drugs for chronic, ongoing diseases that you will take for the rest of your life. That's where they make a lot of money. And vaccines are, ideally, if they work, you may give a shot and a booster, more boosters, but that's not the kind of big profiteering historically that pharmaceutical companies, which are big profiteers, like. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we knew we were going to need a vaccine, the pharmaceutical companies basically cut really good deals for themselves. They got themselves in a situation where they got a lot of help on the international level. And sometimes there was actual, like low interest loans, other, different companies, different benefits. But they came out getting a lot of what they did financed, or at least helped early on in some cases. In other cases, what they got was the research. They got the science. And one of the great stories of the COVID pandemic is the amount of sharing of information, DNA information, other data across platforms, across countries. National borders went down. There was an incredible effort to get to the heart of the matter as quickly as possible. And the pharmaceutical companies were allowed to tap into that and take advantage of it. So research done by scientists around the world, research done by agencies inside the US, in some cases, financial support and encouragement. And also, finally, when the vaccines were developed, incredibly generous contracts. Now, some companies limited their profits because they got federal aid and benefits. Other companies did not. Pfizer did not. Pfizer went for it. They went for the maximum profit. And they got incredible, because they came up with their vaccine early on, they got incredibly generous contracts to distribute the vaccines. And once the initial vaccines were distributed, then to do second and third rounds. And so you're basically guaranteed a lot of money. What did that mean? Well, Pfizer, Moderna, and BioNTech, which is associated with Pfizer, in roughly a year into the period when the vaccines were coming online, 8 months to a year in, there was an estimate made by researchers who monitored these things that those companies were making $1,000 a second, $65,000 a minute, $93 million a day off the vaccine. I mean, this is incredible amount of inflow of money, right? And they were making record profits. They were bragging about making record profits. They weren't sacrificing, saying, we realize how much this vaccine is needed. We realize how much our ability to develop it was supported by society and by governments and by researchers around the world. And so we're not going to take a profit, or we're going to take a small profit. That wasn't what they've done. They've taken exponential profits. And to give you an example, just this week, Fortune magazine came out with its Fortune 500, right? And as an example, Pfizer's revenues were up 129% in 2021. 2021 being the year really of the vaccine, the year of the vaccine. So 129% increase in their revenues, which is pretty good. But here's the big deal. They moved up 34 points on the Fortune 500. That almost never happens. The idea of a pharmaceutical company, which is a pretty old school, staid, existing entity, to make a 34-point leap upward on the Fortune 500, that didn't happen because they did something, that was had never been done before. They created a vaccine in a difficult situation. They did it with a lot of help, and they have made an astronomical amount of money. Now, they predict that they're going to make $32 billion off the vaccine this year. $32 billion. And the profits are, because you're not developing new things, you may be altering them some. The profits are overwhelming in this regard. So ask yourself this question. What if that had happened during World War II? What if this was a different circumstance, obviously, but a defense contractor, right? And before the war, they were in a certain circumstance. They were at a certain point on the Fortune 500 or whatever existed in that day. They had profits of a certain level. Then suddenly, they're making something that's necessary for the war, and their profits go up more than 100%. They move up massively on the Fortune 500. They're predicting tens of billions in profits coming forward. What would have happened during World War II? Well, it's very simple. Harry Truman, then a U.S. Senator from Missouri, investigated the defense contractors, and where they found evidence of this, they were held to account by Congress and via taxation. There was a 90% tax. I'm going to emphasize that. A 90% tax on profits you made as a defense contractor above what you had made before the war. So if you were making $100 million before the war, and suddenly you're coming in, you're up to 150 million, your 90% of that is going to be taxed, right? Of that excess profit. We have had no such accountability in this time, even though Donald Trump himself referred to the fight against the pandemic as a war. And so we've allowed an incredible level of profiteering to occur, and we seem to continue. There's very little evidence of a desire to crack down on that. I'm stunned that that the sort of sweetheart deals that Pfizer and other companies got are continuing, and whatever price they put on, governments say, "Yep, that's great, let's go for it." Well, the interesting thing is other countries negotiate drug prices. We don't. And one final aspect of it is, this is not a secret. If you read the financial papers, and I do, the head of Pfizer is constantly bragging about how much money they're going to make. Why is he doing that? Because he wants investment. He wants to have more money flow into his company so that they can get bigger and corner more of the market, not just for vaccines, but for pharmaceuticals in general. And so what we're doing is creating a situation where monopolies or duopolies get bigger, become more dominant, and ultimately, again, that whole inequality issue we started with, we begin to see a situation where those who are invested in these companies become exponentially richer, whereas those who need pharmaceuticals become exponentially more price gouged, more challenged, more charged, because obviously as you increase those profits, you also increase the amount of money that flows from people who need a drug to those who produce it.
So what happened between the first half of the 20th century and now? And what happened to have caused us to deal with such crises differently?
Well, look, we could spend the rest of this hour and many hours to come talking about the changes and the development of capitalism in the United States. But because we don't have a lot of time, I'll try to make it pretty simple. The reality is that in the period when we moved from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, you had all sorts of people setting up industries, right? Setting up businesses. And these were individuals whose names we often know, people like Henry Ford and others, who figured out how to develop a company that produced a product that people liked. And because people were distinct and lived in different places, you had a lot of people that were producing a lot of different products in different factories. And they weren't all good, they weren't all honorable, but you did have variations in how they operated. It's why you ended up with a lot of variety. And there was something of a market, right? And what happened was that at a certain point, people figured out, well, I could make a lot more money if I was the only person doing this, or if my company was the only company doing this, or one of a handful. And so you started to see consolidation. You saw it as an example in the auto industry, where you went from, many, many different auto companies all over the United States to a big four with the old American Motors. And then when American Motors went down to a big three, now some people say a big 2.5. And we see this in industry after industry after industry, this consolidation of, companies that were once competing becoming part of a monopolistic or duopolistic circumstance. At the same time, as you started to get bigger and bigger, what were once family owned or individually owned companies figured out that they could make a lot more money if they had investors, if they sold stock. They could still maintain essential control of the company, but that they would bring in a lot more money from people who wanted to sort of surf the wave with them and make a lot of money with them. And that allowed for more consolidation of ownership, more of a kind of monopolistic situation. And it did something else. It got people invested simply in making money, not in making a product, but they just wanted to have big returns on their investments. And that was something very different, something sort of transformational in a sense, because they were no longer loyal to the United States, for instance, certainly not loyal to a community, to a certain place. They supported free trade laws that might, ship a job or a factory or whole industry overseas. And that became a big factor in the pandemic because we had all sorts of industries that we needed for medical supplies and that weren't making products here in America anymore. But in the deeper sense, you created a situation where capitalism was organized in a way to maximize profit for investors, but not necessarily to produce the goods that were needed or to produce them at the rate that was needed. So we ended up in a situation where, as the pandemic hit, as an example, we had all sorts of industries that we needed that weren't providing us with the goods because they weren't producing them here in the United States anymore, or they weren't making enough profit off it for their investors. And so we ended up with a situation that was sort of uniquely badly designed for a crisis circumstance. And it continues to haunt us. This is not just about the pandemic, although I write about it a lot in the book. It's really about the organization of our society and certainly the economy that underpins it in ways that are destructive, that are actually damaging, because it's all about the profiteering. It's not about the service.
Is this a product of neoliberalism?
Sure. But neoliberalism is really just a word that we came up with to describe something that was happening, right? If we pause and step back, we see the roots of this going back a long way. And here's the interesting thing, Mitch. It's not the first time we've been through this. We had the robber barons and the great industrial barons of the late 19th, early 20th century. And these were folks who figured out that they could industrialize some sort of production and become very, very dominant, that they could dominate oil production or they could dominate communications. And the interesting thing was that at the start of the 20th century, long ago, we said, well, we can't have that. That would wreck everything. And so we did have antitrust laws. We had Sherman antitrust and other initiatives. We had regulations, the progressive era. And we don't teach history in a way that would actually have people understand why certain things happen. Many, young people go into a class and they'll get a day on the progressive era, and like sort of simplistic concepts. No, the progressive era from 1900 and you could even argue it blended into the New Deal, was a period when we looked at, incredible concentration of wealth and power. And we said that is antithetical to democracy. And so we broke companies up. We regulated companies. Ultimately, we allowed for, with the Wagner Act and other initiatives, for the much easier unionization of those companies. And so we created counterbalances. You asked in your initial question about the latter part of the 20th century. The answer to your question is, in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st century, we stopped trying. And the key to that is campaign finance. And what happened was that very, very wealthy individuals and interests figured out that they could buy both parties and that they could buy the debate in a way where instead of talking about, what we needed to do to maintain a democracy, to maintain a functional society, we'd have obscure, bizarre debates about, secondary issues or other issues altogether. And we would never talk about the economy in ways that were meaningful. And it's sort of the opposite. In the early part of the 20th century, the Republican and the Democratic parties were competing with one another to try and say who was most on the side of the people. And you had the Socialist Party and at the time a Progressive Party in there also doing the same. Today, we have a situation where too frequently the Democratic and the Republican parties have both been competing to say who's on the side of growth, who's on the side of, economic expansion. And that can sound good if it's put in the right phrasing, but the reality of it is that both parties have tended to support, quite frequently, free trade deals that are incredibly destructive, deregulation that has been incredibly destructive. And while Republicans are certainly a lot worse on this, some Democrats haven't been very good on it either.
As we move to wrap up here, John, in our conversation, in the course of it, I've continually heard you bring up the term utility or utilities. Yeah. Why? What's important to know about utilities?
Well, a utility is something we need, right? We utilize it, and the great mass of people rely on it. It's something that that because of monopolization or because of other factors beyond monopolization, you end up with one company that is dominant, or maybe a duopoly with a couple companies that are dominant, but they essentially serve a utility role. We need them to communicate, to engage in commerce, to connect with one another in all sorts of ways. And so historically, when you had something that had that role, that was such a necessary role, be it a power company that produced heat and light, you either had it municipalized, it was owned by the government, or you had it become a utility, which is that it was privately owned. You had investors, but they couldn't make more than a certain amount of money, basically. That it was regulated in a way that, if you invested in a utility, you did it for safety, right? You put a little money in there, you'd make a little more money, but you were never going to make exponential profits. Well, what we've done now is we have allowed certain companies, certain corporations to become utilities effectively, even if they don't acknowledge it. Although they do basically in their advertising and such, how ubiquitous they are, how necessary they are. And so we've allowed this to happen, and we have not kept up on regulation. We've not, kept up on accountability. And so as a result, we end up with a society in which multinational corporations, which are not necessarily loyal to the US and are certainly not loyal to the great mass of people, and politicians who extend from them, who serve them, who don't want to get in their way, who don't want to do things that they don't want done, effectively create an economy, create a circumstance where when a pandemic hits, instead of the response being, how do we serve humanity? How do we do the most good? How do we get people what they need? Or as an alternative, how do we regulate and how do we crack down on companies that aren't doing that? That's on the political side. We end up in a situation where, as an example, Elaine Chao, the Secretary of Transportation, throughout the whole first year of the pandemic, refused to do a national mask mandate on public transportation because she was going to let the market deal with that. And she thought it might be bad for business and things of that nature. Same with the Labor Department under Eugene Scalia, not cracking down, not doing rules and regulations that were needed. And so it's no longer just a bad company or an irresponsible billionaire. It's also a government and a governing system that doesn't crack down and demand accountability. The end result is you have impunity. And impunity is where the very, very powerful think they can do whatever they want and get away with it, and often do.
John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent with The Nation. You could read his writings online at nation.com, and he is the author of the book, Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. John Nichols, thank you.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be with you, Mitch.